Thanks very much for joining us today for a panel session with some place leaders and some of the organisations supporting them around infrastructure. It forms part of a series of discussions that we're having as part of the place-based UK5G campaigns. So I'm Jess Ellis and I will be chairing today, and I'm Head of Programme Development in the 5G Testbeds and Trials Programme. I'll go to my panel members now to let them introduce themselves. So first of all, I'll go to Rhys.
Hi, thanks, Jess. Yes, Rhys Enfield. I work for West Midlands 5G, which is a 5G testbed and trials project. I lead the infrastructure acceleration piece of work within that project, where we have worked with operators, infrastructure providers, and local authorities, all in the aim of accelerating 5G deployment.
Thanks, Rhys. And I'll hand over to Charles.
That's great. Thank you, Jess. My name is Charles O'Reilly. I'm the Commercial Director with BAI Communications, and I'm working specifically on the 20-year strategic partnership with Sunderland City Council relative to their neutral 5G and smart cities vision.
Thanks, Charles. And on to David.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. I'm David Oliver. I'm the Business Development Director at AWTG. AWTG provide end-to-end wireless networking solutions in 5G, Wi-Fi, IoT space. And we also help businesses to use 5G to innovate and to improve their productivity through use case applications. Prior to that, I worked in public sector and in local government for 20 years. And I've got a lot of experience with digital connectivity space from a public sector perspective, developed digital connectivity strategies, been engaged in many DCMS and BDUK projects, done a lot of barrier busting with the industry, and lots of other schemes. So I'm really pleased to be on this call.
Thanks very much. And last but not least, Gareth.
Thanks, Jess. I'm Gareth Elliott. I'm the Head of Policy and Communications for Mobile UK. Mobile UK is the trade body for the four main mobile operators. That's EE, Vodafone, 3, and now Virgin Media O2.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm going to kind of, move through some questions to the panel members, and I sort of one of the sort of kickoff theme. I think we want to start by having a talk about the organisational challenges from a local authority perspective for asset owners and the organisations and people that coordinate them. So, we know that the responsibility of assets in a place lies between multiple departments across a local authority or agencies supporting them. And coordination and facilitation of all of those multiple asset owners is probably one of the big challenges. And I'm just keen to know from the panel, where have you seen it done well and effectively, and are there any sort of best practice advice lines that you could give our viewers or other tricks for people to follow? So if I could go to Charles first on that one.
Sure, absolutely, Jess. Thank you. I suppose to your point, there are a variation from an assets perspective. They sit across different departments, different divisions, different disciplines even. So one aspect is the realization of the assets with regards to whatever the objective is. So if the objective is to determine the assets that are relevant to, say, in our case and what we're doing with Sunderland, the smart city, then that's an exercise in its own right. What we have found is that Sunderland City, all credit to them, have realised this at a very early stage of their vision in delivering a smart city and what a smart city means. And they've taken the initiative from a leadership perspective to bring in the different departments, different divisions, different, because let's face it, this comes down to individuals and the roles that they have, and involve them and stakeholders in pulling together those assets and what those assets may be used for, may be relative to, and the value of the assets in the overall solution. And that's something they did at a very early stage because they recognise the importance.
Great, thank you very much. And Rhys, how about in the West Midlands? Because I know that you've done a lot of work about bringing the various parties together as well.
Yes, we've worked with all the 7 local authorities across the West Midlands. One thing we did very early on was talk to them about putting digital champions and digital coordinators in place, so they could assist with the whole delivery across their organisation. And it did took a bit of time and effort from those organisations to determine who those roles would be taken by. But where we see it work well is where, you know, the digital champion is someone in a senior leadership position that can actually influence what happens within that council. And the coordinators are people who can actually work across the different functions. So, for example, the property teams, the planning teams, legal, highways, etc., and help facilitate when there are issues. We also had one council where they actually brought in an elected member as well, and we termed that as a digital ambassador, so somebody at the elected members level that could again support what was being done in digital. Also, we encouraged those local authorities to look at digital infrastructure strategies in particular, because that again helps to align all the organisation to the goals of digital and bring all the people along on that journey.
And I just come to you, David, because I think we've touched on quite a lot of the activity taking place within the local authority, but what about those other asset owners? They're like the highways agencies, and have you seen it done well, bringing those guys together and that coordination and facilitation role done effectively?
Yes, I have. I've been fortunate in the local authorities I've worked in. They've been really, really great at that. I would, just to emphasise the point that, don't to underestimate this. I counted about 10 different departments just within the same city council that have got an interest in assets and making them available. From social housing, FM, property, through to legal. Lots of different services have got their own CCTV systems. So yeah, it's really important to appoint a digital infrastructure champion and to give them the backing and the support that they need to bring those stakeholders together, establish that shared vision, to prioritise that work within those different departments when it might not normally be their priority, and they've also got other calls on their resources. So again, that strategic leadership and that backing is key, not just within one local authority, but within multiple local authorities, for example, where organisations are bidding for the DCIA programme. So you've got that, there's 10 stakeholders multiplied several times by the number of local authorities that are putting a bid together, but also with partner organisations such as social housing almos, for example, passenger transport executives. They might wish to make their bus shelters available, and other asset owners as well. Police, for example, may have CCTV columns that could be useful. So yeah, it's getting joined up internally, and then getting joined up with your partners, not to be underestimated, and to put management and governance arrangements in place so that you establish that shared view, that shared understanding of why it's important, and you can put a plan together and manage that through.
And I think finally, just a slight different angle, Gareth, with your sort of Mobile UK representation of the operators. We know that there's quite a lot of sort of barriers, I guess, between the local authority asset owners and the operators and access to them. Again, have you seen that relationship facilitated well? And has it been because the local authority area was had already organised itself well?
I think it's an interesting one because I would suggest that local authorities still have a long way to go, but where we have seen real progress is, we have West Midlands 5G and Sunderland here, two very good examples of this. And it is down in the basis, it's about coordination. I think local authorities aren't necessarily set up operationally to engage with mobile operators, and therefore don't necessarily understand the language or the requirements that we need. Simple things. When we talk about assets, it's what asset do we need? Is it a lamppost? Is it a top of a building? Where does it need to be? Does it need to be in a space where there is people, or a case I had once was, why can't we put it outside of the city? Because then we don't have to look at it. But obviously, within the city is where the demand is. And I think equally, when we've talked about coordination, we've seen, digital champions have been really, really positive. It gives a single point of contact. It allows us to know who we need to talk to, and vice versa. Then there is one person to coordinate with the council and engage with the industry. So really, that sort of coordinating point, but then equally it's the information that is provided, and having someone who is skilled in council, who has the resource to do that, who has the understanding and the skills behind them. Again, it's about that being able to talk to the industry and having the time to do that as well. One thing we've often seen on the negative is that we might have a digital champion, but actually it's only 10% of their time. So it's not a priority, and therefore they don't necessarily have the authority to bring together the several different departments that are there. So trying to keep it back to the positive, I think really it is where we have that, real sort of one, you've got leadership from the council's leadership, from the elected side. Then you have the resources put into it, and those councils that have managed that, and also part of their wider strategy and its real focus on improving digital connectivity, they've managed to then really push themselves forward. But also it's about having that dialogue with the industry, and that turns into a much more positive dialogue as well.
Thanks very much. It's actually quite a nice, some of your answer there is a good segue into the next question that I wanted to just explore, which is about the mapping of the assets in the place, and to what extent should places be looking to make sure that all of those assets are mapped and made available to operators so that they can deploy based on the need of the area or the sector, so to speak. And how easy a task is that likely to be? I guess the question that we really want to get to the bottom of is, what are the critical activities to consider if we think that is a vital endeavour to undertake for a place, and how have we seen it done well, I guess. Reece, have you got sort of a view from your experience in the West Mids again?
Yeah, certainly. We started by looking at assets, because obviously under the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, there was a desire to use public assets for digital infrastructure. So we thought about how we might be able to do that, and started collecting the data from our local authorities initially. So data from the property teams in terms of land and buildings in particular, and also street infrastructure, so lampposts from the highways department. We also managed to collect things like bus stop information and CCTV camera information as well through Transport for West Midlands. So went through that process of getting the data first, and then looking at the quality of that data. So it varied from each party. So there was an exercise to sort of clean it and put it in the same format, so we could then publish it into a GIS mapping tool. And since then, I've seen this done by quite a few authorities as well, where they've managed to map their assets within a similar tool. So to take that information and then potentially make it available to local authorities, from local authorities to operators and infrastructure providers. So we went through a process of trialing, giving access to the data. And certainly we found that it makes it a lot easier and quicker for those operators to establish where there might be a location for a mast, whether that's on a rooftop or a piece of land. And certainly for small cells, lamppost positions, where we've seen most interest, where a few hundred have actually been sort of planned in principle by using the tool. And the feedback we've had to date is that can save about 3 months worth of effort of just trying to get to that information with councils and then start the engagement. So again, we've worked with the council to facilitate those discussions with highway departments in particular, and also with looking at things like the legal requirements. I'd say one thing that did come out with lampposts was where we identified there was PFI contracts on them, which has proved to be a bit of a challenge. So that's being worked through currently, and I believe there's some light at the end of the tunnel, so hopefully that will be resolved soon. But that was, I'd say, an unexpected challenge that we came across. Okay.
Thanks very much, Rhys. And yeah, I mean that's a great example. Has anybody got a sort of example where it's maybe not been as positive, or there's been big challenges to overcome, and what to do about that?
If I could, it's interesting. I mean, it's what information you provide, and we have had councils who have been very impressed with a map that they've provided, and it's got lots of dots on that map. But it's the information behind that that then is useful for operators that are doing their radio planning. They're looking at locations, but it's things like the elevation of that building, access to that building, power is there to that building, and it really is that quality of information. And I think Rhys mentioned that in a moment ago. It is all very well just providing very basic set, but equally, if we don't know what that is it a building, is it a lamppost, and it can be sometimes at the very basics of that. But once we've moved forward and we've got developed that, I think the sort of information that's coming back now can really be a real positive in our planning, and actually can be part of that planning. I think one area we need to be careful on is where some others have tried to then direct mobile operators to build in certain areas. And it again is that understanding of how our networks work. Those networks already exist, and it's about how do we complement them, upgrade them, or enhance them. It's not about necessarily just thinking there is a piece of a property or a piece of land and you can build it there. That may not fit in with the wider network. So again, it's about that coordination, about that dialogue, and ultimately about the quality of information provided.
If I could just come in there, Jess, as well, I just add that, it shouldn't be viewed as a one-off activity. That, collecting that data, it's tough, and filling the gaps, getting that single view of the truth, that's challenging. But also that data needs to be maintained over the long term. So councils will, dispose of buildings over time. They will replace, lampposts or concrete ones are being replaced by steel. They might change the power supply from it being phased to 24/7 or vice versa. So, and they may replace, functional street lights with decorative ones that they don't want to have equipment installed on. So it's not just a one-off task. It's this data needs to be maintained over time. You need tools to do that effectively.
I think that's a really, really valid and valuable point to make. Thanks very much, David. And Charles, have you sort of got the example and story to tell on here with your recent work with Sunderland?
Yeah, absolutely, Jess. And before I mention that, what I would like to add, if I may, this isn't typically an easy task. So if anybody who's looking at it, or maybe they've started and they're at a position of why did they start, it's not an easy task, and there are experts out there who can do this. If you go back to Garrett's point, it is about collaboration. As David has said, a city, as an example, is a living, breathing, dynamic entity. And as Rhys said, there's a lot of different assets, and a city may be collecting that data for different reasons. So in having, as was mentioned earlier, that champion, or indeed champions, because sometimes with the different divisions, you need different people who have expertise and can then collaborate, and that collaboration of expertise delivers the desired outcome. It's one of the things, once again, in the work that we're doing with Sunderland, we've seen they've appointed a champion. They've also made the different divisions of the city and the council and the stakeholders aware of what they're trying to achieve. So that clear communication has resulted in, at the very beginning, an understanding of what the end objective or good could look like. And then there's different ways of getting there. And if you go back to the point of collaboration and the fact that there are experts out there, it's something that they also recognize that, this data, if it exists, sits typically in disparate locations. It's been gathered for different reasons. So how can they pull together what they have? Go back to the point, it's not an easy exercise. And then how can they look to deliver upon the objective, which they've shared across with the different divisions? They've managed to do that very well. In fact, it's an exercise which obviously we're slightly biased, but we like to think we have expertise in, that we've assisted on. Because if you go back to the earlier point that Garrett made, Once you've collected that data, you've then got to assess the suitability for what it is you're looking to use it for. So there's a whole load of, I suppose, typical steps that are fundamental to getting the data and making sure that it's suitable for use, and continuing, as David said, that ongoing exercise. Systems are very important. So is it on disparate systems? Are there different systems that can be used? Or indeed, does it need a new system? Maybe someone else has that expertise and can do it. So a lot of different moving parts, but what they've managed to do well is to recognize this at an early stage and endeavor to bring in the right parts, the right teams, the right expertise to deliver the outcome. And it's an ongoing exercise.
Thank you very much. And I think the theme I'm getting from a lot of what you've said as well is that it's a commitment. And I think that's really important to kind of stress that point, which kind of moves me on to the next sort of topic of questions that I want us to delve into, which is around sort of the business case behind that commitment and that investment. And, you know, how do you play off revenues from deployments versus the connectivity? And then there's longer term, you know, outcomes that you would get from the connectivity. You know, which is more important and or should be most important in a place, and I guess why is it important? I just like to hear from the panel on that. So can I kick off with Gareth, just to give your view on that, sort of, you know, which is more important and why is it important for your place to commit to this?
I think, you know, what we're talking about here is a world that has changed, and connectivity is now critical to everyday life. It's not a luxury, and providing that connectivity to cities and beyond is vital. You know, it's very much critical infrastructure now. So I think this idea of purely seeing getting masts or poles or whatever up as a revenue generator tool it has got to move forward to actually getting that connectivity for the wider community. You know, we can do a lot of things with connectivity now. You know, it allows you to work from home. It's helped us through the pandemic. Digital transformation strategies that councils are putting into place to provide access to their services are based on people being able to access those through their mobile phones or through their home broadband. Equally, you know, we need to have a different perception of what connectivity is. You know, if you engage with local councillors, for instance, you know, physical transport is seen as connectivity, and mobile isn't necessarily seen as on the same par. But actually, you know, as we say, we've just come out of a pandemic, and connectivity is sort of now almost considered more important than physical transport. And I think it's that view of where connectivity sits in a space is critical. And then fundamentally, I think, you know, we just need to really sort of see that places now, you know, if you want to invest in a place, if you want to move into an area, you look at whether it has a broadband connection or how good mobile connectivity is. If you want to attract investment in, you know, it will again be based on whether you have that connectivity. And as we look into newer technologies such as 5G, which are going to bring in the Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 in manufacturing, you know, your place will be more investable if it has that connectivity at its base level. But you have to put that infrastructure in. So I think we need to look at it from this point of view and bring our sort of perception of what mobile connectivity is into the current day, rather than looking at it as a single specific mast that you can necessarily derive some revenue from.
Great, thanks very much. And David or Rhys, do you have anything to add to what Gareth said?
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, Jess. I think in the past, local authorities might have seen MNOs as a good source of revenue, and, you know, if they had well-positioned land or tower blocks, then the potential revenue they could generate from rental fees for that was pretty high. But and also councils have used that cash in the past to prop up budgets, particularly during the last sort of 10 years or so during austerity, when councils have, you know, been forced to find alternative sources of revenue. So I sort of understand why that's happened in the past and why it's been around. But things have changed a lot recently, particularly since the introduction of the Electronic Communications Code in 2017, and that really sort of changed things there. Councils were no longer able to generate significant levels of income from MNOs, and they had to really sort of plan for that income to be reduced over time. As well as that, in parallel to that, I think local authorities have increasingly recognised the socio-economic values of digital connectivity, and certainly the ones that I'm most familiar with. You know, they see the link between digital connectivity, coverage and speed, and economic growth. And it doesn't take much of a Google really to find out all the evidence that's out there that digital connectivity provides social and economic benefits for your area. So I think that's certainly changed now.
And Risa, do you want to come in?
Yeah. I'd agree with David there in terms of the Electronic Communications Code. It's obviously changed the dynamics, and effectively, you know, local authorities, that they can recover their costs, maybe some slight additional, but it's not the cash cow that it used to be. And I think those that have realised that quickly and understand the social economic benefits aspect are the ones that are moving ahead now, supporting digital infrastructure. I think some have still got to get it, from what I see, and that may take a little more time. But to give you an example, when we were looking at, you know, benefits from accelerating 5G across the West Midlands, you know, looking at social economic benefits by speeding up the rollout or the deployment by 6 months equates to about £100 million worth of benefit. So it's fairly significant when you look at that level. You know, and things like David's already talked about healthcare, you know, things like assisted living, you know, that's an area where councils will get benefit in the future. You know, we've been doing exercises with manufacturing, so looking at how 5G can make those manufacturing facilities more efficient. Also transport, so the movement of goods and people, again, improving efficiency. And I actually had the privilege to see one of the accelerator groups who've been through our a cohort that had been through our accelerator, and interestingly, there was one which was a white stick, effectively, for blind people or visually impaired people, and it connected to a phone, and it basically allowed the blind person to navigate around the city using the phone, and also it could sense any obstructions, for example, in the way, which obviously won't work unless you've got the right level of connectivity. So it's sort of a real experience where you think, actually, that's a great innovation, but it'll only work if the connectivity is there. So yeah, some interesting thoughts for councils to start thinking about in terms of the benefits across the social economic aspects. Yeah,
that's great. And just I'll come to you, Charles, in terms of those the business case, really, for local authorities to invest and commit resource and time and effort to their asset management, that making assets available, all of those kind of activities that need to go on in a place to be able to realize some of these benefits, where the ROI from the infrastructure itself may well seem a long way off. But how do you build that business case within a place and get the right buy-in to recognise that investment will bring greater and wider benefits? And from your experience, because you've sort of done that recently.
Yeah, absolutely, Jess, and it's a really interesting question. If I step back for just a moment, we've had the Industrial Revolution. And if you look like somewhere like Sunderland would have been a global powerhouse in shipbuilding. So it was to the fore of the Industrial Revolution. I think it's now fair to say that we're in the digital revolution and the transformation that's actually bringing to all of our lives. In that context, you'd almost have to ask yourself, how can a place not afford to do this? Because go back to Garrett's point, the inward investment, the benefit to their residents, the benefit to their businesses, these all come from digitization and transformation. Absolutely, the infrastructure is crucial And without the infrastructure, you can't develop the innovation. So when you're looking at what we're doing with Sunderland, and it's a 20-year strategic partnership, so it's a long-term commitment on both sides. This really is a partnership. You're looking at the investment in actual commercial terms, and Sunderland realised that to start the journey to deliver the outcomes, because their focus is all about outcomes for their businesses, their citizens, inward investment, that they needed to invest. That was in real terms, that was in their commitment, that was in the champions we've heard of mentioned earlier. From a BAI perspective, we realised there need to be the same commitment. So there was an actual matched funding commitment on both sides. This was a really good example of the public and private sector coming together in a strategic long-term partnership focused on outcomes. And when we look at what we're already seeing, and you break it down, because Sunderland would have other areas that would be well recognised, from an education perspective, from what they're looking to do with assistive care. They were one of the leading councils. So we're breaking it down into, what's that classic, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And we're looking at what are the outcomes that will deliver to the citizens, and then we'll focus on those accordingly. And it really is a long-term view. And I do go back to that point, when you appreciate that within the digital age and the transformation that's delivering to places, indeed to countries, you'd have to ask yourself the question, what place can't afford to do this?
Brilliant. And slightly oddly, as the last sort of set of questions and theme, we perhaps should have done it before what you've just said. But we know that there are barriers to making that commitment, to deploying the infrastructure itself. Perhaps we should have started there. But advice for the viewers watching this, I think, from your perspectives, some places dual hatting from a place position to an industry position, what are the big barriers to the deployment of connectivity in places, and what would your advice be on how to overcome them? What can places focus on or change? So I'll go to Gareth first.
Well, I would say it follows on from Charles, and actually it's the opposite end of that spectrum. We are talking here with councils that get this, and fundamentally that comes from the leadership that's there, and that filters down. And then rather than it be a question of why is that going there, it's this needs to go there. And I think that is where we are in many other areas, that simply hasn't got there. And I really point to that leadership point, because it really filters down. If you don't have a council that gets it and wants to move forward, you then don't have the people who can coordinate it at that level. And then it goes all the way down to sort of at a very sort of councillor level, and a sort of what we still see in today's world is this sort of not in my backyard concern, that essentially, I don't really know why that mast is there. I don't really understand the benefits of it. Therefore, why do I need it? Why can't you move it somewhere else? And actually, planning approval rates are really interesting. We've seen the councils that we have around here that they're actually very positive and in high percentage figures. But in places, elsewhere, that's very difficult, and almost 0% planning approval. And if we're talking about a future where this is critical infrastructure and you can't build it, then those places really are potentially putting themselves in a very difficult position. And we talk about the haves and the have-nots. I was at one council, for instance, where in a community conversation, Article 4 could be used to restrict planning permitted development rights. I mean, that in itself is quite shocking with what is such an important piece of infrastructure. I think also, councils themselves, let's be clear, they are struggling with funding at the moment. That itself filters down into planning departments have the right skills and the right people in place to have the institutional knowledge that is there as people look into other industries and maybe go out of planning. Does it filter through into universities to have planners coming through to work in those councils themselves? So I think, the resources and the help, again, from central government to local authorities to provide that education, provide that information, and provide the funding. We've heard so many times about how important digital champions are, But unless it's properly resourced and properly funded, I go back to that point about having a title that just literally says you've got 10% of your time to deal with this, with the whole number of other things. Is that really going to be prioritized? Is that going to be a real priority of that person and therefore that council? So I think, we going forward, funding is an issue, both at how the planning departments are funded, but also at, if we're going to do this properly, we need to ensure that those councils have that ability to do it right and resourced well as well.
Great, thank you. And David, do you have anything of view on that, on those barriers to deployment and how to overcome them?
Yeah, I think so. I'd sort of, if we assume that like the leadership and direction is there, I would sort of just support what Gareth said there in terms of, councils have had their budgets cut phenomenally over the last 10 years. There's no end to the pressures that they're under for social care and having to deal with the pandemic. And certainly some additional resources for this would be really welcome, and particularly the DCIA programme is a great example of this, of DCMS putting some funding in to help local authorities to do this and to develop repeatable models that other authorities can reproduce. But I think I probably also mentioned that there's actually quite a lot that local authorities can do without having to spend a huge amount of money. There are quick wins. There's a lot that can be done in barrier busting. It's just getting everyone's mindset into that space where digital connectivity as a social and economic enabler is not a nuisance or a responsibility of MNOs to do. It's about collaboration, and certainly working with MNOs and fixed fibre infrastructure providers to establish a common view, common understanding of and joint working arrangements that enable MNOs and fixed fibre operators to deploy their equipment in ways which are sensitive to the local environment and local concerns. That's a quick way, and that doesn't take much. It just needs a digital infrastructure champion who's got the time and the space and the support within the organisation to get started. Really, I would, particularly in terms of 5G, I think the digital infrastructure toolkit is a great place to start. That's been developed by DCMS and been taken forward by West Midlands 5G. It's really, really helpful for 5G. So that's my tip for the day.
Great, thanks. And Charles or Reece, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, if you don't mind. So yes, some of the points Gareth raised, certainly leadership, and I'm sure that's one Charles will talk about, definitely a key factor. We see it with some of our local authorities, the ones that digital is driven from the top, they're far more progressive and things get done more quickly. They have dedicated resources. It's a lot more effective. I'd also mention education. So certainly with the Electronics Communications Code, within the operators, they have armies of people who are experts in this field. Local authorities don't, and therefore it's difficult for them to understand the implications of it, and to quite often use agents, which in the past has meant that the relationship between operators and councils has been more of a confrontational one, and trying to shift that to a collaborative one, takes changes in behaviour on both sides. So that's a key in making the changes, that people realising that they need to collaborate, and I'd say that's on both sides, not just on one side. Also, the operators, when they're approaching the councils, the more that dialogue they have, if they explain what they're doing, explain why they want to use certain structures in certain locations, it all helps with the level of understanding, and therefore there's potentially less resistance and there's more dialogue, which helps the whole thing move forward more smoothly.
Great, brilliant. And Charles, finally.
Thank you, Jess. Yes, if I might add, what I'd really like to say is this isn't easy. It's complex, because if it was easy, it'd already be done. And not only is the leadership element crucial, it's crucial on the journey, but the vision and the ambition that goes with that leadership and the journey is key to success. Yeah, you have to have a vision of where you want to be, not necessarily at the end of this journey, because as you think you're getting to the end, as with all transformational exercises, you're not quite there. It isn't the end. But you need to have an understanding of where you want to be, the objectives you want to realize, and the outcomes you want to see happening. And in that context, the outcomes, when you appreciate from a place perspective, what is a city? A city is obviously for its citizens. It's where people live. It's the effect on their lives. And indeed, with Sunderland, one of the topics that has come up increasingly to the points of education and the points of the citizens is, you do this right, it has a positive generational impact on a place, on a country. How often do you get an opportunity to be involved in something that can actually deliver those types of results? So in recognizing that, back to my point, this isn't easy, because if it was, it'd already be done. It's a complex, layered approach that has to involve the right stakeholders. It's got to recognize that those stakeholders have different values to add. There's different partners that need to be brought in at different times. And as I said, there's expertise out there to allow for this. There's assistance, there's funding, there's a real drive and a capability I'm seeing in market and people's mindsets and where people want to be, what they want to deliver. And we really just need to continue to tap into all of the great work that has started and help it continue, and be prepared to cast that net a little bit wider and realize that people are at different stages, or maybe you have not started the journey. And, this is a great example of where they can reach out and maybe get that assistance and help them realize that, yeah, it can be done. And there's others that are doing it.
Great, thank you very much. And that is the end of our little panel session. I just want to thank everybody because you've offered some incredibly valuable insights. To wrap up, I've got one question to ask you all, which is quick fire. Doesn't matter if you all agree, but if you are talking directly to a place that is early on in this journey, hasn't started it, is listening to this thinking, crikey, it's really hard, how do I begin? What would be your one piece of advice for them to start to focus on as soon as they've watched this? I will go to Rhys first.
Thanks, Jess. Well, I actually wrote down, there's not just one thing originally, but I would definitely say digital champions and coordinators, because it definitely helps move things on dramatically. And just something I have learned when we were doing the mapping of assets, we've since discovered Ordnance Survey have a layer of land and buildings that are government owned. So that's a fairly quick way of local authorities being able to find some data now if they're starting that exercise.
Brilliant. Two things, but it was also a very useful second one. Gareth.
I'd written down everyone together and bring the separate departments, get everyone around the table. But ultimately, I think it still comes to someone needs to do that, and that's your digital champion.
Great. And David?
I would say talk to the local authorities. Talk to Rhys is incredibly helpful. Other local authorities, they're ahead of the game. They're ahead of where you might be. They're always very, very willing to share. And they've been through the pain that you're about to go through, and they've got a lot of good advice and guidance, and documents and templates you can reuse, and there are quick wins. You're not trying to boil the ocean. There are steps you can take along the way. Brilliant
advice. Thanks, David. And finally, Charles.
If they're starting that journey, they're on the right track. Keep going. Don't be daunted. The outcomes and the potential for your place are massive, and reach out as people to help you.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. Look forward to talking to all of you again soon. Thanks very much. Cheers.